welcome to the show. I'm Zerlina Maxwell. On this International Women's Day, I'm so excited to be here. But we get into it with a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine that lasted long enough for hundreds of civilians to escape the city of Sumy, east of Kyiv, and thousands to escape Irpin, a nearby suburb. But Russia's ceasefire offer only covered 5 major cities, and millions of Ukrainians remain trapped and displaced as Russian forces continue to hammer parts of the country. The UN has increased its estimate of civilian casualties by 100 to just over 1,300, and it believes the real figure is much, much higher, but it's still working to confirm hundreds of civilian casualties in battleground areas. The UN also says that more than 200 million people have fled Ukraine, and half of those people are children. During a hearing this morning, top U.S. intelligence officials estimated up to 4,000 Russian soldiers have died since the start of this war. But none of these assessments have changed Vladimir Putin's course, as evidenced by Moscow's ramping up air attacks in recent days. Few issues in today's Congress spark bipartisanship, let's be clear, but holding Russia accountable for this seems to be one of them. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell announced today a bipartisan agreement had been met to include $14 billion in aid for Ukraine in the government spending bill. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced the House is planning to hold a vote today on a separate package that would empower the Biden administration to impose tariffs on Russian goods and suspend Moscow from the World Trade Organization. It would have also halted the U.S. import of Russian oil. But that's a step that President Biden took into his own hands earlier today.
Today, I'm announcing the United States is targeting the main artery of Russia's economy. We're banning all imports of Russian oil and gas and energy. That means Russian oil will no longer be acceptable at U.S. ports, and the American people will deal another powerful blow to Putin's war machine.
Joining me now is Texas Democratic Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. First of all, Congresswoman, happy International Women's Day to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you as well. And it knows that when women work, women succeed. And I'm delighted to celebrate this day.
Same here. Congresswoman, do you think President Biden's decision to ban imports via executive order affect the efforts that were already underway in the Congress to do the same thing?
Well, they're two different pathways of a legal authority. I think he was absolutely right. You know, we were in the White House yesterday on a number of issues, and I'm very glad that the president mentioned his consideration, of which many of us had already recommended that we stop purchasing any oil product from Russia. His executive order is powerful, but it'll be even more important. It'll be complementary for the Congress to establish it as law. Russia needs to know that we are unified with the executive and Congress in our opposition to his vile, terroristic, and violent, if you will, cruel, brutal, and murderous war. It is Putin's war, and he needs to know that on the world stage, his behavior is unacceptable, and his killing of children and women is unacceptable.
Are you unified? Is that the sense you have right now on Capitol Hill, that both sides of the political spectrum are unified around this particular issue?
Well, it's amazing if we continue as we are, which we should. Republicans and Democrats have supported the idea that this war must stop, that it is important that we find a way to go back to the peace table or even to the peace table. But while that is happening, we are supporting the alliance, meaning the NATO alliance, allies who have now strengthened and rebuilt NATO under the guidance of President Biden. And we are prepared to stand as strongly as we can on the tactics that are being used, which includes removing them from the WTO, not buying any products from them at all, completely imploding their ruble, which is now 1 cent on the dollar, maybe even less, and taking them away from any privileges internationally as it relates to financial transactions. Anything more that we can do, and we should, is to bolster up Ukraine with the necessary weapons that they need. Yes, we have been united on that. I don't want war. I don't want the war to spread. I'd like to see a resolution of it. But in the meantime, this is so devastating. It is near World War III that we should stand united. There shouldn't be any peeling away of divisiveness based on party affiliation.
Do you think that's going to last, though? I mean, gas prices are predictably going to go up as a result of this decision. Do you think Republicans are going to play politics with that and bash President Biden with high gas prices, even though on a bipartisan basis they pushed him to this decision?
Well, Zelinda, I'm very glad that you asked that question because that question has been discussed. I think it is important that the American people know that it's going to be a few difficult days or months, but that we have not ignored the plight that many who are on fixed incomes, vulnerable populations, low income. I happen to believe that there should be some consideration of these individuals with some sort of subsidy to supplement individuals that have this particular crisis that they may face. We need to continue to explain to the American people what is happening and continue to tell them that we're looking for solutions that can help bring down that cost of gasoline. We know people have to get to work. They're just coming outside of the pandemic. We're not forgetting them. But at this point in time, in order to not create an atmosphere of a World War III, we've got to stop Putin and really the loss of life. He doesn't even care that upwards of 4,000 of his own soldiers are dead, and their mothers and fathers didn't even know that they were leaving for a war. They thought they were leaving for the training that military personnel do, training exercises. And then to know that little babies, little 6-year-olds, the elderly, women, and others are being bombed in their homes. This is simply for the ego of Putin, and it just cannot last.
And the images of toddlers and infants, it's really difficult to watch. I want to turn to WNBA star and your constituent, Brittney Griner. She's from Houston, Texas. She's been detained in Russia for weeks now. You've called for her immediate release. Is there anything you can share about that? I know that is a very complicated and sometimes secret process to try to resolve situations like this, but can you give us an update on her situation?
Well, first of all, we are all praying for Brittney, her wife, and her family, and I ask the nation to do so as well. Her plight, as has other detained Americans, imprisoned Americans in Russia, has gathered the sentiment in the hearts and minds of Americans. Brittney gave athletic joy to Nimitz High School, to Baylor, and just to the nation, playing in the WNBA. And then, of course, spending years playing in Russia. She is not an unknown figure in Russia and has been a welcomed guest there. And so the outrage is that why was this young woman targeted as she traveled back and forth, as she's done dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of times? We think this is a false, put up and Putin-based attack on her. But we realize that she has counsel in Russia. We want to be respectful of that. We want to be respectful of her family and the need to ensure that all is done to bring her home safely. At the same time, we were pleased in the meeting with the president to raise the issue, to present the president with a letter asking for her release and the help that we might give as members of Congress. And I'm very glad to note that not only the administration, the White House, but the State Department are well aware of Brittney. And let me be very clear, others who are now held in dastardly conditions by Russia. Russian incarceration is inhumane, cruel, and deadly, as we've seen before. So I want to make sure that we do nothing to harm her release. But yes, I'm demanding her immediate release because I think these charges are put up charges. I might use the term bogus. I am a lawyer. I know that there are laws that different sovereign nations have, but we ask, there's no reason that the matter could not have been resolved without this massive incarceration. And when I say that, detained and as well in conditions that I don't think are too pretty. And so long ago, and we're just getting notice, at least for those in the public arena, about this now. So Russia purposely did this under dark of night. And she does not deserve this, nor do the other prisoners who have been held wrongly in Russian jails.
Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, thank you so much for starting us off on this International Women's Day. Please stay safe. Only about 8% of U.S. oil imports come from Russia. We actually export more oil than we import here in the United States. But despite that, there's no question that Americans will feel the impact of Biden's decision to ban Russian oil imports at the gas pump. President Biden, perhaps anticipating that political blowback for this decision today, sought to place blame squarely on Vladimir Putin. Take a listen.
Since Putin began his military buildup on Ukrainian borders, just since then, the price of the gas at the pump in America went up 75 cents. And with this action, it's going to go up further. I'm going to do everything I can to minimize Putin's price hike here at home.
Gas prices here are already at record highs, but if there's one consolation, it's that Americans will be far from alone in feeling pain at the pump. The EU depends on Russia for about 45% of its natural gas and about 27% of its oil imports. They're working to slash these imports by the end of this year and achieve full energy independence, quote, well before 2030. The United Kingdom today announced a plan to phase out its imports of Russian oil, which makes up about 8% of its oil supply by the end of 2022. And joining me now to discuss is Hagar Chemali. She's the former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the UN and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Geoeconomics Center. So Hagar, break down the significance of this global effort to hit Russia where it really hurts them the most through its oil and gas exports.
Sure. Well, the oil and gas sector to Russia's economy plays a significant role in its own economy. Russia is the world's third largest producer of oil. And for the United States, we don't import that much Russian oil and gas. For us, it's 8% of our total energy imports. So last year, we paid Russia over $5 billion worth of energy imports. And today, for the price of per barrel today, since it's increased since then, if we had done it through this year, it would have been $10 billion this year. So we've robbed the Russian government of $10 billion from the sales of our purchase of Russian crude here. However, that's something that the Russians will probably make up with their sales from China. And so that's not really what's so important. While it is important that they don't make money off of the US markets, what's important here is that we've communicated to the Russian government that we're not afraid to go for the jugular. This is the heart of Russia's economy. It's the one point of leverage that they had over, or do have over, the Europeans, for example, and the Europeans joining in the statement that they would decrease their energy consumption from Russia is quite a blow to President Putin, because it shows that we're willing to obliterate Russia's economy over this, and we're not going to let them benefit from these sales.
I've also been closely tracking the private actions and private companies and their behavior during this particular conflict. I mean, every single hour, frankly, a private company is pulling their business out of Russia, pulling employees out of their companies in Russia. Today, a bevy of companies, including McDonald's, Starbucks, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, they all are stopping operations in Russia. And that comes as Putin passed what amounts to a relief bill for his citizens. I mean, what effect do you think this can have on top of the ban on Russian oil imports and the other crippling sanctions that were imposed by the U.S. government and also European allies?
That's right. We can't underestimate the power of the unity that you're seeing here in how not just governments are reacting to Russia's aggression, but private companies making these decisions for themselves. So sometimes when you've heard people push back and say, well, Europe didn't impose the oil and gas sanctions the same way that the United States did or Canada did, for example, it doesn't even really matter anymore, because European oil companies like BP and Shell decided to divest from Russian oil, to sell their own stakes that they had in Russia's major oil company, Rosneft, to not import or purchase Russian crude. These speak volume steps like this, because it sends a message to President Putin that everyone is against what's happening. Nobody is going to tolerate this type of behavior. And they're willing to hurt President Putin and the Russian government really in a way where it'll inflict real pain. Now, again, I want to caution that the change, the response that you see to sanctions doesn't happen overnight. It's not that Russia won't feel this economically quickly. They will feel it very quickly. But usually it takes time. The oil sanctions against Iran were what brought Iran to the negotiating table, but it took 2 years of those sanctions. And I know for me personally, I would prefer not to see this war last that long. But hopefully these sanctions, President Putin knows how they work and knows what happens with them. And so I hope that he'll understand at least that it'll help increase pressure to put an end to this.
In terms of the private actions, do you think Putin's response, obviously, as you mentioned, he understands how the sanctions work, but it's rare for all of these private companies to pull all of their business out of Russia. I feel like there's a compound effect that will happen because the whole world is unifying against him. How do you predict he'll respond to that? Is there any precedent in his past behavior that could give us a clue?
Well, the precedent that I go back to doesn't so much go to sanctions, but it goes to the war in Syria. And unfortunately, I have a lot of lessons that I personally learned handling the first 2 years of the Syria crisis when I was at the White House. And it relates to both how dictators themselves react when they face resistance, which is usually to double down, and also how Russia behaves in war, because I saw how they behaved in Syria. And the fact is that they have no regard for civilians. They don't care if they have to mow the country down or bulldoze it, if it means that they stay in power. And I don't want to give a projection of doom and gloom, but I want everybody to be realistic about how the Russian government and how President Putin approaches war. For a lot of reasons, dictators in general don't like to approach war and lose. Their response when faced with resistance is to double down. And that's why you're seeing the Russian government bring in mercenaries like the Wagner Group, which is a horrific group of human rights abusing thugs. That's why there are reports that they're recruiting Syrian fighters. Bringing foreign fighters into this would the destruction, the human rights abuse, the torture that you could see from that would be horrific. And it would complicate things, which is why one of the reasons why I argue that the lesson I learned from the Syria war was to put an end to these types of wars as soon as possible, because they can drag on and they can become extremely ugly. And all the things you said that you would never think of or consider, like military engagement, you end up starting to consider later on, except it becomes too complicated to do it. So this is what I expect of President Putin. I expect him to double down and to lash out further. And that is why I say the two things he needs, and I'll wrap this up, the two things he needs to stop is both in a serious military threat from Ukraine. He is already facing a serious threat from them. We need to back that up, we and the Europeans, as much as possible. And we are, but the more the merrier there. And then the other side is, and it goes against what every political science professor will tell you, but you got to give him something to go back to Moscow to step down and say, okay, well, I got this on military assets or equipment in the region, whatever it might be.
Well, that was a really good explanation. I think that can really give folks at home a reality check, because there's been so much talk in the last week or so about how the economic sanctions are, gonna get one of Putin's closest advisors to push him out, And I think that, setting the analysis in your previous experience with Syria is important context for this particular moment. The Biden administration sent a delegation to the oil-rich nation of Venezuela to discuss energy sanctions the U.S. placed on them years ago. Would it be smart to stop working with one autocratic leader just to start working with another one? I saw this headline today and I was like, I have questions.
Listen, I winced when I saw the news about going to Venezuela because it would absolutely send the wrong message, because it sends this message that, okay, well, right now, because it benefits us, maybe we'll ignore the human rights abuses that you've committed in order to get some oil. However, I don't want to jump to any conclusions. I really don't, because I believe the Biden administration, in what they said was the reason for the visit, was to talk about a wide range of issues. The fact is that they have not come out with a very clear policy regarding Venezuela. And so it's unclear how much they're going to be carrying from the Trump administration and how much they're going to be changing. The oil sanctions on Venezuela for prohibiting U.S. purchase of Venezuela oil, they were put in place in 2018. And to be honest with you, I do not expect that to change. I'm going out on a limb here saying that, but I really would be surprised for them to start importing oil from Venezuela, or some people have said Iran, and that seems completely unacceptable. I don't think that they're going to do something like that.
Hagar Chemali, it's important to have your analysis on days like today where there's so many headlines, and I'm like, I majored in international relations, but I need an expert to help me figure out what's going on here. Thank you so much, as always, for being here, and please stay safe. Coming up, UN says 2 million people have fled Ukraine so far as Russian forces keep up their attacks. But for millions of people still trapped or displaced inside the country, is it safe for them to try to get out? We'll talk about that next. Europe is experiencing the fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II. According to the UN, 2 million refugees have left the country, and a spokesperson for UNICEF says that includes 1 million children. But their journeys have been tough, with Russia continuing to shell cities despite agreeing to a ceasefire and multiple failed attempts to establish humanitarian corridors. Ukrainian officials were able to evacuate hundreds of people from the city of Suri, the first successful humanitarian corridor. But it came hours after Ukraine says Russia targeted civilians in that same city. And joining me now is Kimberly St. Julian Varnon. She's a historian and a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's been in contact with African students in Sumy. So Kimberly, you tweeted earlier today that you were trusting the ceasefire in Sumy because it didn't seem like a Russian ploy. What made this corridor different than the others?
So I think the key thing for me was this is the first time I had seen a ceasefire discussion from the Ukrainian government about Sumy. I followed the Sumy municipal government on their Telegram channel, and they had also certified it. But also my students were getting in touch with me asking if this was real, because as we had seen, Russian disinformation about potential ceasefires in Sumy and Kharkiv had gotten a lot of people angsty and ready to go, but they had fallen apart and they didn't actually culminate. But the important part for me was the certification of this ceasefire by the Ukrainian government.
Where are the African students that you've been in contact with? I talked to you earlier this week on the radio, and you mentioned that you had been in regular communication. Give us an update on the status of the folks you've been talking to.
So I've been in contact with African students and Indian students from Sumy. And so up until yesterday, they were still stuck in their student dorms and, in and out of the bomb shelter, depending on the air raid alarms. But all of them that I've been able to contact, they're on their way to Poltava. They're out of Sumy. And so Poltava is near the midpoint of Ukraine, and many of them are heading forward to Lviv and trying to get out of Ukraine through Poland or Romania. So they are in a much better position today than they were yesterday.
I want to play you some sound from CIA Director William Burns testifying today before the House Intelligence Committee. Let's take a listen to that, and I'll get your reaction on the other side.
I think Putin is angry and frustrated right now. He's likely to double down and try to grind down the Ukrainian military with no regard for civilian casualties.
You mentioned that things are a lot better than they were, say, a week ago. But as Hagar was just explaining in the previous conversation, Putin is predictably, or all the experts saying he's going to double down here. I mean, what are some of the things that you are most concerned about as you're talking to people on the ground, so you have a really good sense of the real-time conditions. What are your biggest concerns in the short term?
So my biggest concerns are, one, getting these foreign students not just out of Poltava, but out of Ukraine, because as we've just seen, the war is going to get much worse and much harder for civilians. So that's my first concern. My second concern is we still have a very large, Ukrainian resident population that are staying. You have women who don't want to leave their husbands or their fathers. You have a lot of little children, whose parents, can't move them right now. Sick people, chronically ill people. There are a lot of people who simply do not have the resources to leave Ukraine right now. And they need food, they need water, and they need medicine. And so what we saw in Sumy today, there was this, 10-hour window in which buses could come and get people out of Sumy, not just foreign students, but also Sumy Ukrainian residents. They were leaving, but also some food and medicine came in. So I think the next part of this I'm concerned about is making sure those people who did stay, including if any foreign students did decide to stay, that they're still getting taken care of in this situation.
What are some of the obstacles? You mentioned people with different abilities, the elderly, folks who, can't carry their children on their backs to get out of Ukraine to, a place that is safe. Speak to some of those obstacles that people may not think about, because maybe they've never been in this situation where they literally have to put all their clothes on their back and escape for their lives.
Definitely. And so just for the students at Sumy, it was literally you have a go bag ready at any time, because the news about the ceasefire broke around 4 or 5 a.m. and they had to be ready to leave. But for many people, think about people who are chronically ill or who are disabled, who don't have freedom of movement. They can't just grab everything and get ready to go. For all these people who are stuck in hospital beds, they don't have these options. So I think we also need to keep the visibility on people who are chronically ill or who are disabled. But also, Terrell Starr helped move a woman who's going through cancer treatment. She had to disrupt her cancer treatment to leave, right? So these are also incredibly vulnerable populations that we need to think about and consider who can't leave during this, and they still need our support.
We'll be talking in a few minutes later on the show specifically about the disability community and how they're being impacted by what's going on the ground in Ukraine. Kimberly St. Julian Varnon, thank you again for being here today and for giving us an update on the folks you've been in contact with. Please keep us posted and make sure to let us know if they are able to safely get out of Ukraine. And please stay safe yourself. Today, on International Women's Day, a member of the Ukrainian parliament posted this message.
Usually on this day, kids are giving their mommies flowers and cards to say how special they are. This year, our kids have been robbed of this opportunity. They are either at refugee camps or very far away from us, to keep them safe. This year, Ukrainian women will receive flowers, but these are not only flowers that we will be carrying, because we are also carrying guns to protect our country along with our men from Putin, crazy dictator, and from the war that Russia is bringing in. I want to congratulate all Ukrainian women who are standing up and fighting. You are incredible.
It's a moving tribute to what's happening all across the country. Ukrainian women are joining men in taking up arms to defend against Russian forces. Besides taking up firearms, women are making Molotov cocktails and helping build barricades and other defenses. All of this may come as no surprise to Ukrainians. Women have been part of their country's armed forces since 1993, with their roles and numbers increasing after Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. Lauren Leader writes about this in her piece on MSNBC Daily titled, Ukraine's Formidable Not-So-Secret Weapon, Women. And Lauren Leader joins us now. She's CEO and co-founder of All In Together. Happy International Women's Day to you. Why do you think it's so important to recognize the contribution of Ukrainian women and how they're helping to fight back against Russia's invasion?
Well, one of the truths about democracy is that in every place in the world where there have been struggles for democracy, where there have been fights inside institutions and within countries to gain democratic freedoms, women have been central to that fight. And we know that when women participate more fully in democracy, those movements are more successful. So fundamentally, women are essential to the democratic movement in Ukraine. But they're also essential because, of course, in a time when every body, every able-bodied citizen matters, women matter more than ever. But you're right that women have played a vital role in the Ukrainian military for a long time. In fact, in 2018, it was women veterans of the Ukrainian military that fought to pass a law that gave them full access, equal access to all the same roles on the battlefield as men. And that turned out to be extraordinarily important. There are now significant numbers of women in commanding roles at the front lines. And then, of course, now we've seen this extraordinary surge of volunteers, of women who have stepped forward, including the member of parliament you just heard from, the former Miss Ukraine, and a 79-year-old woman among them. So women are going to be vital to this fight, both in terms of carrying arms, but also in terms of just the role that they play in peacemaking.
I think one of the things that folks don't realize is the percentage of women in the Ukrainian military is a lot higher than our own military. So this is significant. It's not just, numbers that are just feel-good numbers. They're actually significant. I mean, do you think seeing women join the front lines of the resistance in Ukraine has contributed to the strong support Ukraine is seeing from all around the globe? I mean, these images are powerful. It makes me want to go learn Taekwondo again or something. Seriously.
No, I mean, look, they're so incredibly inspirational. And what I'm blown away by is not just the way in which women are so fearlessly stepping into the void and taking up arms, women who've never done that before. There are also stories of women who are getting their children to safety outside of Ukraine, turning around and returning to their country to fight for it. But I'm also blown away by some of the stories of the soft power, the ways in which women have confronted Russian soldiers and compelled them. Well, first they gave them food and tea, and then compelled them to call their mothers in Russia. And, this might on its surface sound like sort of a fluffy, sort of soft thing to do, but in the end, it's actually turning out to be an extraordinary insight into the weakness of the Russian forces. A lot of these young men are conscripts. They are there against their will. And Ukrainian women getting these men to call their mothers is an extraordinary sort of exercise in soft power, because that has real influence on their resolve to continue fighting. U.S. national security experts have pointed to those viral moments that were caught on video as a sign of weakness in the Russian army that can be exploited. And it's, who else but a woman on the front lines would ever think to do that, to offer the enemy tea and a phone call to their mother? I mean, it's just an unbelievable example of how women lead, about how women think about these things. And, around the world, some of the most intractable conflicts have been solved by women. It's when women come to the table that we find solutions. God willing, that'll be the case in Ukraine, but there's no question. The hero of, there are many heroes in this, seemingly intractable fight, but certainly women rise to the top of that list.
They're so incredibly brave, and seeing them is almost giving me goosebumps because, they're risking their literal lives to stand up for democracy in their own country. And I think that's something here, as Americans, we definitely can relate to that mission. I mean, let's turn to the topic of refugees. 2 million people reportedly from Ukraine have now fled to other countries, including many women and children. We've been showing a lot of that footage and photographs throughout the show. There was video today of women refugees in Romania being given flowers for International Women's Day. Do you think it's important to recognize the sacrifice of women refugees in addition to these women fighters? Because many of them are leaving the country to keep their families and children safe. I mean, not everybody's going to be able to pick up arms and fight back. Some people, have to pick up their toddler and get the heck out.
Absolutely. And every time I see these images of women carrying their children, miles for days, I mean, I think there's not a woman among us who doesn't relate to just how extraordinarily difficult that is. The mothers of infants and toddlers and children of all ages, the courage that it takes to keep those children from feeling just absolute terror, trying to be a rock for these young kids who are so traumatized as they're ripped from their homelands and everything they know. And, on International Women's Day, Zerlina, we're all looking at these unbelievable images coming out of Eastern Europe. But it's important to remember that there are tens of millions of women and children refugees all over the world, in conflict zones. Everywhere, women always bear the brunt of the most horrific circumstances. And it's an important time, I think, for us to recognize just how important these refugee issues are, not just when it's on the front page of the news and on the televisions every night, but all the time. I just have to say a word about my daughter, Chantal, who is a refugee from the Congo, who escaped extraordinary circumstances and is one of the very, very few refugees around the world who made it, who was resettled to the United States. And it's just a really important time for, I think, all of us to recognize how lucky we are, and to take a moment to do something to support a refugee organization, to give even a few dollars. This is a worldwide crisis. It's a constant crisis. And maybe this moment will help us see for the long haul the role we all play in making the world a little more hospitable for people fleeing conflict and adversity.
I think these women are such an inspiration. I think it teaches us all to do what we can as individuals to protect the democracy where we are. And they are doing, I think, the most they can do. And I hope that all of them can stay as safe as possible. But again, life and death stakes. Lauren Leader, thank you again for being here on International Women's Day. Please stay safe. Today is International Women's Day, and to commemorate, all of our guests today, I don't know if you noticed, are women, and all are stars in their respective fields. I began these amazing conversations very, very early this morning. I have to say I've been up for a really long time. When I spoke to Chelsea Clinton on my radio show Signal Boost on Sirius XM, I asked her how she stays optimistic in the face of so many problems facing women in other vulnerable communities.
We do know what we need to do to try to help alleviate suffering in the here and now, to help support our most vulnerable in the United States and around the world. And so I can either focus on, the cascade of tragedy and terror that so many people are living under, the kind of existential threat of climate change. And I think you're kind of, intersecting dystopias is a really painfully apt description. Or I can think about, what can I do to try to hasten the arrival of those solutions? What can I do in the here and now to try to be part of something good happening instead of just being kind of complicit and a bystander to the bad? And I choose to live in the what can I do space.
A Republican candidate for the Michigan State Legislature is getting criticized, even by his own party, for comments he made on a live stream on Sunday. His comments come at the end here.
We're a year after the election. We're a year after, guys. It's too late. It's too late. Sorry. We lost.
I had that same attitude as a parent of 3 daughters.
Election integrity bill.
You should have fought already. You should have fought already.
All of us are talking at the same time.
Exactly.
So it was 6 people.
Having 3 daughters, and I tell my daughters, well, if rape is inevitable, you should just lie back and enjoy it. So.
The candidate, Robert Regan, has since said he was misunderstood. He says he meant that accepting the results of the 2020 election would be like telling his daughters to, quote, lie back and enjoy it. But I just have to say, that's not even in the script. That's just my visceral reaction. The bigger question, though, is why would any public figure or anyone use such a false and frankly nauseating analogy? And also, you have 3 daughters? Regan also took heat over remarks about Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Because of the weak leadership of Joe Biden, again, using Afghanistan as the example, Ukraine being corrupt and, they're pointing weapons at Russia and they can't depend on the United States. So again, Putin's job is to protect his people, his families, the children there.
He said, Ukraine is corrupt. Russia is just protecting itself. You know, and that reminded me, where have I heard those talking points before? Oh, Vladimir Putin's propaganda. Joining us now is Susan Del Percio, a Republican strategist and MSNBC political analyst. And Susan, 2 years ago, when Robert Regan ran for Michigan legislature, his daughter tweeted that people should not vote for him. And now I understand why. Does that tell us something when his own daughter wants him to lose? I mean, how is this person running for something?
Well, I'm just waiting for the other two daughters to put out a statement this election cycle, Zerlina, because I think any woman is just absolutely horrified. Any man should be horrified by those comments as well. And as far as Ukraine, this character is about, 3 weeks outside of even Fox News and their propaganda. So he is just obviously clueless and is playing to, I don't know what constituency of racist, because he does have a past of racist behavior, anti-Semitic behavior, tweets, etc., hatred of women, hatred of democracy. I don't know how big that constituency is out there. So, and I realize that he will most likely win his May primary, but the only salvation is, Zerlina, it looks like because of redistricting, he won't be able to run it successfully this fall.
Whew. I mean, it feels to me, when I think back to how we got to a place like this, where somebody can run for office and say this kind of thing in public. And I think back to the first debate in 2016 when Donald Trump responded to the Access Hollywood tape by saying that it was locker room talk. And then he went on to become the president of the United States. Do you think that he normalized this kind of talk about sexual assault, rape, women, just really the misogyny that we've seen from a lot of Republican candidates?
Oh, absolutely. And he dismissed it as just, locker room talk, like you said, and that we don't have to be so judgmental. I mean, the whole thing's ridiculous. But what I find even more obscene is that the state party leadership, while they condemn the remarks, hasn't called for him to step out of the race. That is what is truly bothersome. And even from just a political lens, just pure politics, it would help the Republican Party of Michigan so much more to call out this candidate who can only have a seat for about 6 months or 8 months. And that way they at least pretend to look like they have a conscience, and instead of staying behind it, because guess what? This is what Michiganders are going to hear for the next 3 years. Is all they're going to hear about is this candidate being representative of the state party. And that's just politically stupid.
The other piece of what he said that was frankly alarming is what he said about Ukraine. And it really reminded me, and I've been thinking a lot about it, I've been going back and reading the transcripts from Donald Trump's first impeachment. I think that now that these events are happening, all that happened during that first impeachment look very different because new facts have been added to this historical record. Republicans like Jim Jordan defended Trump's holding up military aid to Ukraine because they said he was concerned about corruption. But now that Russia has invaded Ukraine, they seem to have conveniently forgotten that they said any of that at the impeachment, even though it was on tape and I can read the transcripts today in 2022. What is your reaction to the Republican hypocrisy on this point? I mean, are they going to be held to account for the fact that they perpetuated lies in line with the Kremlin about Ukraine during that first impeachment to defend Donald Trump, but now have changed their tune?
I don't think they'll suffer the consequences that they should. Let's face it, it's very consistent behavior for these types of Republicans to double down on issues. This guy Regan is also a QAnon conspiracist. He is willing to just throw out whatever I think he thinks Trump voters would like. But again, he's so ignorant on the facts that even in the far right of the party, Republican Party, everyone's opinion has changed on Ukraine. But to your initial point about the first impeachment hearing, it is so significant the way that that narrative got into the bloodline of politics and government. and how we see our elected officials. Last week, we talked about Lindsey Graham, feeding into Russian propaganda. These things are used against democracies everywhere, including our own. So when we hear a character like Regan speaking, that's used against us abroad and against the Ukrainians. This person clearly has no idea of what it means to speak with responsible, in a responsible town square. I guess that form says it all.
I just always say, we need better people running for office because, some states and districts aren't sending their best. One of the things I want to talk to you about before we wrap is about gas prices, because we saw President Biden's decision today. Gas prices are already really high. And so this decision is only expected to make the average price go up a bit. I mean, what do you say to those Americans at home who are feeling the price pinch and they're feeling that in their wallets, while at the same time, I kind of expect Republicans to hit Biden with this, even though they were pushing for it. What do you think?
You're absolutely right, Zerlina. There is no question about it. They will talk about the need for, to boycott Russian oil. They will also now, the Republicans are talking about how it's the pipelines that's not open and blaming Biden for not being, gas resistance. The fact is that the Russian oil and gas accounts for about 10% of the U.S. intake. We can probably offset a bit. The bigger problem is inflation compounding that. So it will be very difficult for the Biden administration to keep warding this off, because you're right. The Republicans will hold it against him and every Democrat running in 2022.
Susan Del Percio, thank you, as always, for being here. It's always fun to talk politics with you on International Women's Day of all days. Please stay safe. Before we go to break, last night, the Senate unanimously passed the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill. It makes lynching a federal hate crime, punishable by up to 30 years in prison. The bill is, of course, named after Emmett Till, the 14-year-old boy whose brutal lynching in Mississippi in 1955 became a watershed moment for the start of the civil rights movement. But lawmakers have been trying to pass this bill for a lot longer than that. The bill's chief sponsor, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, said in a statement, after 200 failed attempts and over a century's worth of efforts, I am proud to say that Congress has finally passed legislation to criminalize lynching, a shameful instrument of terror used to intimidate and oppress Black Americans. The bill now heads to President Biden's desk for his signature, and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is applauding the decision and says the fact that it took so long is a bitter stain on America. We'll be right back.
Hallelujah, it's long overdue. After so long, the Senate has now finally addressed one of the most shameful elements of this nation's past by making lynching a federal crime. That it took so long is a stain, a bitter stain on America.
Ukrainian mothers and children are fleeing their homes, some leaving with a single bag or just a few of the basic necessities. Not enough supplies to cover their days-long journey to escape Ukraine, especially when they have kids in tow, which is something Polish moms and volunteers immediately recognized. So they stepped in. At a train station platform in Poland, where thousands of Ukrainians would be arriving, refugees were greeted by a line of empty strollers for any mom who needed one. It's an incredible act of humility and outreach from one mom to another. Joining me now to discuss is Rebecca Coakley. She's the program officer for U.S. Disability Rights at the Ford Foundation. And Rebecca, what was your reaction to seeing that image of the strollers at the train station gifted by the Polish moms to the Ukrainian moms? It really gave me goosebumps all over, and it showed that literally you can do whatever you can. Whatever you can in this particular moment, this is the moment to try to help.
Thank you so much, Zerlina. As the mom of 3 kids, my oldest is 11, my youngest is 4, and as a mom with a disability who depends on strollers to get her kids around, it was so heartwarming and at the same time brutally terrifying to think about what these parents are experiencing in this moment.
One of the things I wanted to talk to you about specifically today is understanding what it is like for somebody who has a different ability or who is particularly vulnerable in this particular situation, who can't just get up and get their go bag and run out the house or put a kid on their back and run out the house. I mean, how hard is it right now for people with children, the elderly, and folks who have disabilities to get out of Ukraine? I mean, this situation isn't easy for anyone, but particularly this community is particularly vulnerable.
You know, recent numbers tell us that there's at least 3 million disabled people in Ukraine. And that's not counting those that are institutionalized in psychiatric facilities or who are incarcerated. We also know that war, like climate change and pandemic, is a mass disabling event. So the notion of being able to just pick up and leave is a complete luxury. On the best day, disabled people are viewed as expendable. And let's be real, this is far from the best day. We are terrified for our people and what it means. We're watching people with disabilities literally being stacked in the back of pickup trucks because there isn't accessible transit that's plentiful enough to help move people from Ukraine to Poland and to other countries. And furthermore, once they get there, really harsh immigration policies like the public charge that exists in other countries in Europe may result in people just being turned around and sent back.
And I think the question is to where. That would be my question at that point. According to MSNBC opinion columnist Liz Plank, one Ukrainian couple was turned away at the border, to your point. They suffer from HIV, they're both HIV positive and suffer from visual impairment and heart disease. They said they have official documentation to exclude them from military responsibility, but said, quote, no one cares. I mean, how common do you think it is for Ukrainians with disabilities to find themselves in the situation that you mentioned, where they actually do successfully get to the border, but they are turned away and they can't cross over?
We're hearing stories left and right about this happening. We're hearing stories about people who are able to evacuate and get to a shelter only to find out that they can't provide the kind of care that they need. And so, do you face life on the street or do you die of bed sores? These are unreasonable choices for people to be having to make at any point in time, let alone during a massive crisis like what we're seeing in Ukraine.
It's such an incredibly hard thing for me to hear, given the fact that, I mean, I think a lot of people at home have aging parents and understand the seriousness of what you just said about folks who are bedridden and elderly in that way. What kind of resources do people with disabilities have in Ukraine? I mean, what did they have before the invasion? Obviously, that is not the case now, but was there any infrastructure at all, to your awareness, to get resources to those communities before the invasion?
There were grassroots disability rights organizations. There were some family-centered organizations, but a lot of services came out of the social service sector. You know, Ukraine still has a lot of orphanages, institutions, deaf schools. And yet we have continued to hear rumors that some of those places were some of the earliest places attacked because people couldn't leave. You know, and I think that's a whole nother piece of it. If thinking about the deaf community, what does it mean when you don't have ready access in a moment like this to accessible information? You don't exactly see sign language interpreters on every newscast in the Ukraine in this moment. You're not actually making sure that they're available at these shelters. And so it's an issue of access to resources and also an issue of access to equitable information.
Rebecca Cokley, I'm so incredibly proud to have you on for this important conversation, because I wanted to make sure we got this in as we cover every single angle and aspect of this story in Ukraine. Thank you so much for being here today, and please stay safe. A bit hard to hear, But as I end tonight's show, I wanted to leave you with Yo-Yo Ma playing Ukraine's national anthem as a musical protest in front of the Russian embassy in D.C. on Monday. He told a passerby he was playing there because, quote, we all have to do something. I think that's a good message to end on tonight. That does it for me. I'm Zerlina. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. The Mehdi Hasan Show is coming up after a short break right here on The Choice from MSNBC. Hi, I'm Zerlina Maxwell. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more from Zerlina by clicking any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thanks for watching.